aside from the hosting team, who are we? We are the research network on just sustainability transitions in cities, in short, the JUSTRA Cities Network, or the JUSTRA team. And we are a collaboration of the Vital Cities and Citizens Initiative and the Dutch Research Institute for Transition, both of which are affiliated to the Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Our aim is to deepen, translate, and connect knowledge and practice on just sustainability transitions in and around cities. Now, what is important to know is that we are a network, but we also research networks, and we're interested in uncovering how networks can contribute to justice. As part of the JUSTRA Cities Network, we've taken over the curation of the wiki on sustainable and just cities that some of you may know was one of the outputs of the Urban Arena project that ended just recently. The wiki serves as an open source meta database that contains various databases, and one of the things that we will do with our new creating role is the development of a new database to add to the wiki, and that's a database on translocal networks. When this is ready, we will share it with the rest of the world to make sure to stay updated on the progression if this is something that you're interested in. We also curate a publication and event series. The publication series features essays and blogs and interviews, reports of all the events we organize, but we also strive to be a platform for students who are working on these topics. So as an example, we had Issa Laurent writing on living streets and how different cities can learn from each other. Lara Hendricks, who's interned with us, wrote her master's thesis on networking for sustainability. Clara Glachon, who also interned with us, wrote a blog that will soon be published on translocal networks and mobility. And our previous research assistant, Franco Crudi, whose blog on the use of social innovation to trigger sustainable energy transitions was just recently published. And we also organize many events. This is the 7th event in our event series, and we held a few movie screenings and webinars prior to that too. We use these as learning and experimentation opportunities to integrate the values and the insights that we gain from our research. This is why this event and a few previous ones have started showcasing what we call a chat storm, and I'll tell you more about this later, but it's a tool to democratize these events to the best extent possible. If you're curious to know more, we have also released a virtual hosting guide for justice and sustainability, and all these events are featured as reports in the publication series, and there is also a YouTube channel with the recordings of these events. Today's event is a direct collaboration with Drift and the kickoff to the Drift Food Month. Drift is a Dutch research institute for transitions located here at the Erasmus University. It concentrates 4 sectors of activity for transitions, namely academic research, consultancy, education, and engaging in public dialogue and debate. And these activities are centered around 7 themes, which are transformative knowledge, welfare and justice, social innovation, new economies, urban transitions, governance and politics, and resources and circularity. And under these last 2 themes is where Drift's attention to food comes in the form of the series project. The series project stands for Sustainable, Innovative, Resilient, and Interconnected Urban Food Systems, which is quite a mouthful, which is an EU joint programming initiative funded project that strives to facilitate urban food systems transitions. And it does so by fostering governance capacity in attention to creating learning arenas for food planning and decision making. There have been some interesting publications already coming from this project, which you can find with the link shared in the chat. And we will share a document with resources from today's event, but more on that later. As part of the Drift Food Month, there will also be an event next week on the future directionalities that agri-food systems research should take. So that is on Thursday next week, same time as today. And coming back to today, I have the immense joy of announcing that we're joined by Julian Adjeman and Annick Hebbink. Julian is Professor of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University and the originator of the term Just Sustainabilities. And Annick is Drift's very own foodie, working on as a postdoctoral researcher on the series projects. We're also joined by the wonderful Julia van Leeuwen, who will take graphic notes throughout the event today. You can see a fragment of the product of our rendition here on screen of the last event we held a little over a month ago, which was on the topic of translocal solidarity in just sustainability transitions. So now it's time for a quick check-in poll. Now, before I hand over the floor to our first speaker of the day, I will quickly explain what we mean with this chat storm. It is a way to democratize the choice of questions asked during the plenary session and the way for participants to have ownership in the facilitation of the Q&A. So throughout the event, we ask you to write down the questions that pop up in your mind in the chat box, or to share any resource you deem relevant, whether it's websites, articles, songs, poems, blogs, anything. The questions will serve as input for the discussion. And to make sure you can stay focused on the webinar during this real chat storm, we will collect all the resources in the document that we will share with you after the event. To get the ball rolling, I will nominate the first person to ask the question, after which it will be your turn to have a say. When your question is nominated, you can unmute yourself to read out your question, mention if you're directing your question at any one panelist in particular, and then nominate the question of another participant. And we will collect 2 questions, then have the panelists answer the questions, and then go back to nominating questions. But for now, just remember to put your questions in the chat if anything comes up. And then I have the pleasure of leaving the floor to our first speaker of today, which is Annick Hebbink.
All right. I'm very happy to be opening today's session and to share some of the work that I've been doing at Drift, and to kind of set the scene before Julian will speak a little later. But a little bit about me. I've been at Drift for about 3 years now, working as a food transitions researcher, but I have a background in development sociology, foresight, and broader transformations thinking. And these fields have really shaped the way that I look at food systems change. And the research that I've been doing at Drift really focuses on exploring the transformative potential of urban food and kind of examining the role of equity and justice in food systems. And so I do this by combining critical foresight and transition thinking. So for today, I would like to reflect on the question that you see on the screen: what is the future of food? And we'll use critical foresight to gain insights in how we can shape our future of food, or should I say futures. So I hope that after my talk today, that I've encouraged you to critically reflect on the future or futures of food, and that I've kind of shown you some ways to look for kind of ways in shaping the future in a more desired direction. Next slide. Just a little bit slow. There we go. But let's start at the beginning. Food. I find food very interesting because it connects a lot of different things. So it connects people, activities, but also flows of goods and ecosystems. And food is something that's very crucial to us as individuals, because food is connected to our health and our identity. But it has this interesting way of connecting us to kind of global systems, but at the same time being something very intimate, something very special, or something very personal to us. Because we eat food that is sourced from the other end of the world, and prepare dishes based on recipes kind of that originate from an entirely different place. And then we share that food with the people that are closest to us, making food something very social. But, and I probably don't have to, this is not something new that I'm telling you, but there's also major sustainability issues connected to food and food systems, as food systems today are responsible for 30% of GHG emissions, and they are a major contributor to global biodiversity loss. Looking at the human dimension, we see an increasing number of people that are going hungry, or that are suffering from diet-related diseases, making diet-related disease actually one of the main cause of death at present. On top of that, there's also a lot of injustices across the value chain, leaving a lot of people vulnerable or without a proper livelihood. So all in all, it's a system that's not very fair. So looking at the systems that we see today, in all fairness, in responding to my own question, what is the future of food? I'd say the future of food looks pretty bleak. So I'll state the obvious in saying that we need fundamental change towards more just and sustainable food systems. My computer is very slow in reacting. There we go. So in order to direct fundamental change into a more desired direction, rather than kind of the trajectory that we're on today, it's useful to know what you're heading for. And this is where the system perspective comes in handy, that I use quite a lot, as this provides a much clearer insight into how food connects to all kinds of other people, places, and activities. And to help people think about the system, we've developed this sustainability compass, as we've called it, which shows the core dimensions of what food systems are about. So what I want you to take away from this figure is that this is a system perspective that shows that food systems are not just about producing food, but that it's about providing healthy, adequate, safe diets, a clean and healthy planet, economically thriving, robust food value chain, and just, ethical, and equitable relations in the food system. And it's precisely because of these multiple goals that you see in food systems that I believe food can become a very powerful vehicle for change. Because food can then be considered as a tool to addressing multiple goals within the system. Meaning that interventions or approaches that we design can lead to synergies across goals, so across this context. But this is also more or less the problem, because food is often not considered in a systematic manner. And by not considering food in a systemic way, sustainability is very often reduced to GHG emissions, which leads to very painful and persistent blind spots, particularly on the end of social justice and equity. Either because we're not considering it at all, because we're only looking at kind of the planet and the diet part of this compass, or because we've defined it in an incredibly narrow and excluding manner. For example, by focusing only on compensation for people who lose from a transition rather than including them in the design of the transition itself. And by overlooking this very crucial dimension that I've highlighted here of sustainability, we often pursue sustainability pathways that do not add up to all four dimensions. And sometimes this even results in the exacerbation of social injustices, or will lead to trade-offs across these four dimensions. And so the question that I find urgent to address is what future images can strengthen justice and sustainability in food systems. So let's talk a little bit about the future and why this is worth exploring. First, having an idea of what the future should look like, such as a vision of a sustainable food system, gives you an idea of what pathways of change can look like, what direction they should go in. And also, this pathway then kind of carves out what might be solutions or interventions that add up to that future. So then taking a future perspective is useful for strategic planning of how we might arrive at that desired future. And this can help provide a look into what practices we need to look out for in the present, if we have an idea of what future we want to move towards. But there's always a but, of course. This is also a reason to be critical of what future images you see, hear, and read about, because future images are not neutral or equal. Not neutral in the sense that future images are always created by people who either willingly or unwillingly frame the future in a particular way. And not equal in the sense that some future imaginaries hold more power than others, or are able to take up more space in the debate. So it's important that we remain critical of future imaginaries that are dominant and that are kind of sold as leading to more just and sustainable futures, because these images of the future do lay a claim on what the future should look like, and they give shape to what actions we take and what investments are made within the sustainability domain. And so together with a number of colleagues, I've examined what futures are dominant in the current debate on food sustainability. And what we found is that the majority of these food future framings are oriented at more tech-based solutions, which firstly are not considered from a wider systems perspective. So, for example, targeting a very specific element of the value chain, for example, production. But secondly, that they also very often overlook the cultural and the social implications of these tech-based approaches. For example, when innovations are developed by for-profit, by private actors, making them very difficult to access for smaller actors, which only exacerbates inequities across the food system. But what I find perhaps the biggest shortcoming of all these future framings is that they fail to envision a change in power or a change in governance structures, and that they have no structural plans to address injustices. So generally, they include the word justice and sustainability, but they haven't really thought it through in a systemic manner, meaning that these futures ultimately will point towards incremental change rather than to food system transformation, which is urgently needed. So, to create just and sustainable futures, we need to create space for the alternative future imaginaries that are able to reimagine these persistent and structural issues that are embedded in governance structures, like the dominant global food economy, or how the food system is governed and by who. And looking beyond these dominant framings within the debate, there are countless unheard and marginalized future framings that are based on principles of justice and well-being. And it's these alternative futures and the practices that people develop that I find interesting, because they present sort of pockets of the future that we desire in the present, because these provide kind of spaces where people are tinkering with new ways of thinking, doing, and organizing in the hopes of connecting to the alternative food future that they envision. So with that being said, I explicitly look for alternative future imaginaries in the urban food domain, hoping to find traces of both ideas and practices that can connect to more sustainable and more just futures. And looking at the urban domain, I think, is very promising, because we do see a broad range of different alternative practices. And I think this is partly because sustainability challenges are very felt in cities, and partly because of the density of both people and activities in cities, but also because it's the place where you see such stark disparities between socioeconomic status or opportunities and so on. And it's this necessity for change, this desire to improve your life and to see things in a better light, that is a strong driver for citizens, social groups, and social entrepreneurs to develop new alternative ways of doing, thinking, and organizing food systems. And because of this, the urban food domain, or the urban domain, is a seedbed of sorts for alternative practices. And it's these radically new ways of organizing the food system that provide building blocks of sorts to shaping more just and sustainable futures, using food as a vehicle for change. For example, the image shown top right are the urban food entrepreneurs of Swam, who envision a more circular food future, providing urban dwellers with the means, kits to grow mushrooms on the leftover coffee ground. Or the community garden Rotterdamse Munt, that is right bottom, that is located at the heart of Rotterdam, and they provide a much more livable green space to people who cannot afford urban green, or perhaps provide connection to people who would otherwise maybe even be in social isolation without kind of that space being there. So I see huge transformative potential in this urban food domain, and I see clear glimpses of what I would like the future to look like. And I say, It is not necessarily because of their production kind of volume or yield, because that's not really where their strength is. But I say this for the social values and the principles that they are able to really weave into the urban fabric. So the possibility of making urban spaces more livable and with shared spaces, making urban areas more prepared for climate impacts, maybe even resulting in more cohesive neighborhoods, but also kind of giving space to practice that can educate and create awareness that are very important for changing human behavior. And I think one of the things that I find kind of the most, well, not important, but a very interesting characteristic as well is, and that makes them very valuable, is that they find place-based ways to address sustainability and to meet local needs. And all in all, I see kind of within these alternative urban food practices, the possibility of foundation, or I see the foundation and values for a more sustainable and just urban society. So building on these diverse practices, we could enable kind of a patchwork of approaches to overcome kind of blind spots in justice and equity that we see in cities. But looking at urban governance, there are still considerable challenges. First, these urban food practices often lack stability when it comes to their key resources, such as funding or access to urban space. And here, I think it's also good to realize that the majority of these practices emerge from activities of people who have a passion for it or who see a need to develop something, but it isn't their main livelihood, and they've developed these practices with whatever was present in their environment. Time. And while urban governance or public actors could support these practices, we see that they're often a little bit misunderstood because the majority of these practices lean on these voluntary activities, meaning that they're foundations, initiatives, or enterprises. Most public actors find them hard to define or understand or even include in governance strategies because they think they're unreliable or just kind of elite hobbies. So there's some definite challenges to overcome. And when it comes to amplifying alternative futures and practices, I think this is also just a starting point, because I'm convinced that the urban domain is rich of alternative futures and practices that can enable transformation of food systems, but we only know so much. As for example, my work is mostly based on what research is out there, which is in a slice of what there is in reality. Because what I've been working with is very much skewed to the European or North American focus, meaning that there's a lot of alternative food futures that are not captured and remain unknown. But at the same time, we see that there's major powers and vested interests that would prefer to keep some of these alternative futures hidden because they might threaten their positions of power in the future. So there's still a lot of work to do. And here's my last slide. Sorry if I took a bit too long. So how can we harvest this potential? How can we shape the our urban food features? I think this starts with considering social justice as a key goal for food system sustainability, along with environmental, nutritional, and economic goals. It requires that we remain critical of dominant future framings and interrogate them for what kind of future they really envision. Questioning whether they really propose a radical change or if it's just kind of the same system but with sustainability frosting on top. It's about amplifying alternative, unheard, or marginalized futures that are able to reimagine a system in more radical ways and allow these practices to grow and to mature. And I think the last point is to facilitate kind of a planning of a patchwork of these diverse practices that we see emerging across cities that build on principles of justice and well-being. And this was my last slide, as I promised. Now I'm going to unshare my screen. Okay, and now I immediately have the pleasure to also give the floor to Julian, who Yannick already said is a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University, and his seminal work on just sustainability has really been key to our way of understanding just sustainability transitions at Drift and within the broad JUSTRA work. And he has written many books on the topics of just sustainability, food justice, and smart cities, amongst which his latest book, which is also open access, so I do recommend you to Google for it, Sacred Civics, Building 7th-Generation Cities. But maybe Julian will tell us a bit more about that himself. Julian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anique. Lots of points that you raised there, I think, are going to be amplified in my talk. And just as a preface, it is very much focused on North America, but I do bring in an example of what I consider to be the most advanced city in the world, which is actually not in North America, it's in Brazil. So let me start by offering a land recognition. I'm speaking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm speaking from the traditional land of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, their past, their present, and their future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. There can be no food justice, no food sovereignty, unless we recognize the lands on which we live, play, work. And this is something that I think is becoming more and more important in North America generally. And I'm glad to see that that's happening. So problem number one, we need to acknowledge something, certainly in North America, that we cannot separate hunger from racist urban planning. Just let that sink in for a second. What's Julian talking about? We cannot separate hunger from racist urban planning. Where are the food deserts in North America? They're in the neighborhoods that were formerly redlined. These were neighborhoods that were designated by putting a red line on a map as having no government or private sector funding, no mortgages, no loans. These redlined neighborhoods are the same neighborhoods now that are hotter in the summer in the United States. It's been shown statistically that this is the case. More people die of heat stress in these redlined neighborhoods. And as I say, they're also the environmental justice neighborhoods, and they are the food deserts, if we want to call them that. And I'll challenge that notion of a food desert. So we can't separate the hunger that exists in urban America from racist urban planning. So let's think about this concept of the food desert. I mean, on the one hand, I can see it's a useful concept because pretty much everybody knows the term food desert. It's pretty intuitive in many ways. Sometimes they're called food swamps because there's a preponderance of junk or fast food. But from my point of view, what food desert doesn't convey is the racist origins of these areas. Food desert is quite a sanitized concept. Now, on the one hand, as I say, it's a good concept because the United States Department of Agriculture has mapped all the food deserts, and there is money available for projects, healthy eating projects, healthy corner stores, etc. But on the other hand, food deserts erases the racism of these neighborhoods. And so food justice scholar, some of you might know, Ashante Reese, an anthropologist, suggests the concept of food apartheid. Because food apartheid is intimately related to policies and practices, current and historical, that come from a place of anti-blackness. So this idea of food apartheid, I think, is gaining traction within the United States. Now, if I was giving you another talk, I would be talking about Minneapolis and how Minneapolis is a very interesting place. It's one of the greenest cities in the United States, but it's also one of the most racially divided cities in the United States. And 93% of police officers in Minneapolis do not live in Minneapolis. They come from outside. But I want to make the point here that urban planning in the United States, get this, is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. So when you come to America, when you visit American cities, nothing is an accident. This isn't an accident that we have these segregated neighborhoods. This is by design. This was planned for, and urban planning is the toolkit through which white supremacy was carried out in spatial forms. I just want to briefly mention Oakland, California. Oakland is across San Francisco Bay from San Francisco, and Oakland is one of the most divided cities in the United States. The main division that I want to talk about is West Oakland from downtown Oakland. And West Oakland is a food desert. It wasn't always that way. It was an industrial neighborhood where people grew stuff in their gardens, but over the years, over 100 years, structural processes, not individual misdeeds, but structural, institutionalized processes have restricted access to healthy food in this flatland area, which is marked in yellow on the map. Racist mortgage lending, city planning, driving freeways through neighborhoods have all devalued this flatland area, and this capital devaluation and the flight of white folks up into the Oakland Hills and the Piedmont area and to Berkeley has created really a devalued food desert in West Oakland. And if we look at Oakland today, Nate McClintock says it is a crude mosaic of parks and pollution, privilege and poverty, Whole Foods, which is a supermarket in the US, and whole food deserts. And again, if we look at that map and then we look at the redlining map, you see those red areas? Those red areas are largely black or brown neighborhoods. Redlining was a way of stopping these neighborhoods succeeding. This is why we have, throughout the United States, these neighborhoods where largely black and brown people live and poor people live, and the neighborhood quality is much lower than the more Tony areas. And you can see there, again, West Oakland is separated from downtown Oakland. This is how you see it today. The freeways are racist infrastructures. They were built through black neighborhoods, and on the left you see West Oakland, and on the right you see downtown Oakland. They were built to sever neighborhoods. And I'm pleased to say that as part of Joe Biden's package of relief, part of it is devoted to removing these racist infrastructures. It's the so-called Joining Communities initiative, rejoining, resuturing these communities that were split 60 years or so ago by the building of these freeways. So again, structures, policies, plans were put in place to segregate America. So that was the first problem. We cannot separate hunger from racist urban planning. Second problem, and this I think speaks to some of the things that Anique was saying about narratives and imaginaries and how dominant narratives and imaginaries can drown out other imaginaries. So in the US, we've got a very powerful alternative food movement who asks you to vote with your fork. Vote with your fork. How blind is that? Who can afford to vote with their fork? Only the wealthy can afford to vote with their fork. So this food movement is about environmental sustainability. It's about localism. It's about biologically diverse polycultures, avoiding the use of synthetic fertilizers, etc., etc. It's a call for moving back to family farms. And I've got two images there, the farmer's market and a very common image, buy fresh, buy local. Buy fresh, buy local. So this narrative, along with the predominant whiteness of the alternative food movement, suggests that unlike the advocacy for a polycultural alternative food movement, we actually have a monoculture. It's monoculturally white. Groups of people who think alike, have similar values, similar backgrounds and proclivities, and who've come to the similar conclusions about how food systems should change. But let me jump in on Anique's point about imaginaries. Look at this. These signs, buy fresh, buy local, are available all over the United States, depending which state you're in, Nebraska, Central Texas, Pennsylvania, wherever. They show an imaginary, to me, of a past America, not a present or necessarily a future America that I want to see. There is no blackness or brownness in here. There is no crop diversity. There are no ethnic crops here. This is presenting an imaginary of an America that is past. And I don't need to tell you that it links in my opinion, to some very, very dangerous ideas about nativism, who is supposed to be in America, etc. And we can talk about that more in the discussion. So the food movement is an elite movement. One of our key speakers in this movement is a guy called Michael Pollan. Very nice guy, I know him. But one of his books, Rules for Omnivores, he says, don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. Don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. But you know what? He's assuming that everybody had a choice about what their food was. Many great-grandmothers, African-American ones, were given scraps from the table. Many great-grandmothers came to Ellis Island, came to the United States as immigrants. They had their names changed and they had their food changed. They were told what to eat, how to be American. So this idea then of Pollan's is based on his privileged positionality. And I really want you to get this point, that the positionality of people is incredibly important in terms of what kind of activism they attach themselves to. The food movement is incomplete. This guy represents one of millions of Americans suffering food insecurity. Incidentally, the most food insecure Americans are actually agricultural workers. Can you believe that? But what the alternative food movement fails to do is to conjoin their agendas with his agenda and those millions of Americans who are food insecure. So we have two agendas. We have a food justice agenda and we have an alternative food agenda. The food system is a racial project in the United States. Any of you who are sociologists might know of the work of Omi and Wynant in 1994, where they talked about racial projects, political and economic undertakings through which racial hierarchies are established and racial subjectivities are created. This picture is common in the United States, that you have a grocery, liquor, a store that basically does everything in the neighborhood, but what it lacks is a lot of fresh or culturally relevant foods. As with the environmental movement, we had an environmental justice movement. We have a climate movement, we have a climate justice movement. With the food movement, the alternative food movement, we have a food justice movement. Every single social movement in the United States has a mirror image based in justice. This has to be the case because the environmental movement, the climate movement, the food movement never paid attention to justice issues until they were reminded of food justice, which is communities exercising their right to grow, sell and eat food that is fresh, nutritious, affordable, culturally appropriate and grown locally with care for the well-being of land, workers and animals. And so the food movement, the food justice movement, recognizes food as a racial project and it problematizes the influence of race and class on the production, distribution and consumption of foods. Food justice is a grassroots movement. This is not a movement organized by big, powerful non-profits. This is local people taking action. The Food Chain Workers Alliance, the Restaurant Opportunities Center, Food First, the Food Project. Now, I just want to give you a couple of ideas as well about other ways to see food, because one of the problems that I see is that we look at food as being something that is physiologically important. Of course it is, but food is so much more than that. Food is an intimate commodity that's taken inside the body. We share this across humanity, that we need to eat. But anthropologists have opened our eyes to foodways, how food is manifest through symbols and cultures and our general proclivities for gathering and socialization. So as people eat, as the picture shows, as people meet over food, they begin to define their own identities and memberships of particular groups. And so food informs people's identities culturally, but also racial identities. So food is a performance. I also want to problematize this notion of local food. We're obsessed in America with local food, buy fresh, buy local, local food. But I want to tell you a story about George and Julia Bowling in Maryland. And these are a couple of people, farmers, tobacco farmers in Maryland. Could you just give me a second? My dog is just wanting to get out.
We cue the waiting music.
That's okay. Just, you know, one of the things about Zoom is that we're at home and we have dogs, some of us. So George and Julia Bowling are from Maryland. They were tobacco farmers. Maryland state is trying to get people out of tobacco farming. And so the Bowlings, being good American entrepreneurs, are thinking, what should we grow? What can we do? And they suddenly realized that in the adjacent state, Washington, D.C., there are 150,000 plus Africans who are largely middle and upper middle class. They are diplomats, lawyers, they are politicians, they're surgeons, they are professors. They want to eat locally grown African food. So the Bowlings contacted the University of Maryland Extension Service and said, what kind of African foods will grow in the Maryland climate? Turns out there's quite a lot. And so the Bowlings, with the African community and with the University of Maryland Extension Service, decided to start growing African produce. And the farm sign now says African produce. There it is. How does this happen in rural Maryland? And now there are lots of farms growing African foods for Africans who drive out from DC and then come back with their food. So the question is then, what are local foods? The alternative food movement has lots of ideas about what local foods are. And they think about local as a geographic local. Whereas what the Africans are thinking about is a translocal. They are bringing their local with them, and they want to eat local foods. They want culturally appropriate foods. So who's right and who's wrong? Do we hanker after this geographic notion of local, or do we adopt a more translocal cultural interpretation? It's the same with the Filipinos in San Diego. The Filipinos in San Diego, when asked what is local food, said, well, it's our food. We grow it in our backyards. We eat it in our restaurants. Again, this idea of translocalism, I think, is important. We need much more reflexivity in the US alternative food movement. If we want to build a bigger movement for local food, then we need to embrace that there are different perceptions of what local is to different groups of people. Let's go to Vancouver in Canada. 20% of farmers in the greater Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians. Here's a guy in the field at the moment. There's a very interesting urban planning issue here with the house there, because as you can see, that house has been built onto, maybe a couple of times, housing multi-generational families. This is very common amongst Chinese families, but it presents all kinds of issues for local planning. But my point here is the Chinese Canadian farmers do not use the largely white farmers markets. They use their own farmers markets. Why do they do that? Because of anti-Chinese racism and because of their own entrepreneurial style. I gave this talk in Vancouver about 10, 12 years ago, and an East African woman afterwards came up to me and she said, Julian, I'm so glad you mentioned the Chinese Canadian farmers, because I shop at their farm stalls because they sell what I want to buy. Here we have a sort of almost like an immigrant solidarity over food choices. How much of that registers with the alternative food movement here in North America? One of the saddest events of the last 20 years was the destruction of the largest urban farm in the United States, which is called South Central Farm in LA. It was 95% Latino, huge area, And these two women are farming just before it was bulldozed. These women are from Oaxaca in Mexico, and you can see here that they're standing in a plot. There's prickly pear cactus behind them, which is a traditional field boundary in Oaxaca, but you can also see the chain link fence. What these women have done is created a little bit of home here. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. I grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. See how important food is, culturally appropriate food is, but also cultivating in a style that is reminiscent, creating a garden that is like your garden from back home. The Africans in DC, the Chinese Canadians, the Filipinos, the Oaxacans, everybody is trying to use food to create home, space. And in this case, food is being used for placemaking. Food is being used to make place, to make sanctuary, to make people feel whole. We also have a range of about 50 what we call refugee farms around the United States, places where, like this one in New Roots Farm in San Diego, places where people can go to learn about US agriculture. These are intercultural learning spaces where farmers who have been in the United States for a longer time meet up with newer farmers who want to learn their practices, but also want to carry out their own practices as well. For some of you who are interested, my second to last book, Anique, is The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labor and Identity in North America, MIT Press. And this is also open access if you're interested in looking at the really interesting links between immigration and food within the United States. Now, I want to just give you a couple of success stories. I wrote a paper with my colleague Penn Lowe about the emerging food solidarity economy in Boston. Here's a number of organizations: the Urban Farming Institute, the Food Project, City Fresh Foods, Haley House, City Gardeners, the Commonwealth Kitchen, Dorchester Food Co-op, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and Zero, the composting service. These are organizations all working within what we are calling this local food economy. And here's how it works. First, Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative has a land trust, a community land trust. And in 2013, the city of Boston changed the zoning regulations, allowing commercial and non-profit urban agriculture. So quick off the mark, the Dudley Land Trust rents out 2 farm spaces to local farms. The Urban Farming Institute, City Fresh Food and City Growers, the Food Project, these are some of the cultivators. City Fresh Foods and the Commonwealth Kitchen are some of the processors. These are then consumed by high-end restaurants in Boston. The Dorchester Food Co-op sells some of the food, as does the Haley House Cafe. And then the food waste is recycled back into the land trust. So we have a solidarity economy movement here. We have the beginnings of a circular economy around food, and we estimate there are between 200 and 300 people in this solidarity food movement. And it's based on just sustainabilities. The jobs are going to local people. The jobs pay well and are with benefits. This is just sustainabilities in action, and it's a fantastic scalable model. But in typically American style, nobody's coordinating this. This is laissez-faire. I want to see representatives from each of these organizations beginning to steer this model, grow this model, grow it up, out, and deep. And remember, we always talk about scaling up or scaling out. Let's also think about scaling deep. Scaling deep is where we begin to change human values and ideas. And that's what we need to do. We've got the tools and techniques to do the scaling up, but scaling deep is more about narratives and discourses and changing the narrative, changing people's hearts and minds. And a brilliant segue into a woman I deeply admire, the new mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu. Michelle became the first Asian American, the first woman, the first mom, the first millennial to be a mayor of Boston. And what really impresses me is her food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. Now, I've been in this game a long time. I've looked at a lot of city food plans. If you want to look at the most progressive city food plan in North America, Michelle Wu's plan is it. It locates food justice as racial justice. It says we need a clear-eyed understanding of how white supremacy has shaped our food systems. This is not wishy-washy. This gets right to the point. And when I look at Seattle, Toronto, Los Angeles, San Francisco, all of these other food plans are wishy-washy. They don't locate food justice as a racial justice issue. And this is a key point that I want you to take away. We need to center social and racial justice within food justice notions. Anik, a little slap on the wrists. I think you said something like we should think about social justice within environmental sustainability terms. Well, I don't think we should think about it. We should center it. It needs to be centered. Just let my dog back in. Well, I'm back. Let's just take a quick look at some of the issues that Michelle Wu considers within the food justice notion. Investing in Boston's food chain workers, supporting Boston restaurants and food economy, expanding Boston residents' access to fresh, nutritious, affordable and local food, leveraging public procurement to drive broader food systems change. And she's just awarded a $17 million contract to a Black food cooperative to start supplying some of the foods to Boston public schools. This is where change is happening. And then strengthening food system coalitions to pursue a food justice agenda. This is so, so important. So I do urge you, if you're interested in looking at what American cities can do, I would look to Boston, because what Michelle Wu is doing is really amplifying community discourses and narratives around food. And this is why she's very popular. And this is why also she is going to succeed. But if I was to give you the best example of a city interacting and in fact taking over the local food system, then it has to be Belo Horizonte in Brazil. Belo Horizonte is basically using urban governance, urban policies to create its own local food system. And to quote, it's an example, a unique example of urban governance in the creation of an alternative food system. Its alterity or alternativeness is due in large part due to conscious public policy making, which reached out to the private sector, civil society and government. And again, it centers justice in terms of a Brazilian constitutional right to food, and also this very intriguing concept that I think works very well, food with dignity. On the bottom left there, you see what's called a popular or people's restaurant. Look at it. It's a pleasant place. It's for $2 US, you can get a full meal. Students, tourists, workers, a lot of people use these people's restaurants. The second picture there you can see is because of an arrangement that the city has with its local farmers in the hinterland around Belo Horizonte. Direto da Rocha, direct from the countryside. The city prioritizes some pictures for local farmers. The city is taking responsibility for its wider hinterland here. But I think the most impressive thing about this is that the city fixes the price. Yep, you heard me right. The city fixes the price in agreement with private sector retailers of certain essential foodstuffs for people on benefits. Let that sink in. The city intervenes in the food market to fix the price of certain foodstuffs. All of this, people's restaurants, the allowing and encouraging rural farmers into the city, the fixing of certain foodstuffs prices, the creation of school organic agricultural gardens. This all costs less than 2% of the city's budget each year. So we do have good examples, and for other examples, go take a look at the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. Many cities around the world are now joining the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, but I would still say that Belo Horizonte is the gold standard. And it's interesting that the project in Belo Horizonte started 30 years ago, 1992. Successive governments, more right-wing, have not taken this apart. This was devised by a Socialist Worker Party mayor back in 1992. The point I'm making here is, if we get progressive policy right, it's very difficult for right-wingers to then change these policies because they become very popular. So I'm going to leave you with that thought, and I'm looking forward to questions. Thank you.
I assume we desire to uphold baseline food production so nobody goes hungry. With that baseline achieved, what does the picture look like in an alternative model or orientation?
Yeah, I was kind of, I read your question while you asked it, so I was kind of pondering about it. But I think my first reaction would be is that looking at kind of the production volume on a global level, we are producing enough. So it's not about producing more. So we've already met that baseline, and it's about kind of distributing it in a way that it arrives at the people who need it, right? So the production is not necessarily the problem, but it's in kind of moving away from how we approach it. And I think we do need to kind of go towards an image that is more kind of region-based or place-based, as you will, and to move away from this kind of export-oriented food system where, well, essentially some countries are dumping foods on other kind of continents, disabling them to have a proper food economy. So I think it's not about kind of reaching a certain level of food production, because we're in effect already there. It's about kind of how can we ensure that it's distributed in a nice way, or in a nice way, in an appropriate way. Sorry. So I think the image that I would have, or the kind of the imaginary that I would have, is to have regions produce much more locally. Now I'm very aware that I'm using the word local, and Julian has just opened up a whole can of words. But it is possible to get kind of the bulk of what you eat from your region, and obviously there will always be kind of export products, because we cannot seem to live without coffee and chocolate, and that just cannot be grown, for example, in Europe. But we can kind of rein it back in a bit more to our regions, and I think that's the puzzle that we should be looking at. I hope that answers your question.
How can we as citizens advocate for better and just food systems, and how could food forest play a role, or in the same line, backyard and front yard farming?
As I said, the food justice movement really is a grassroots movement. This is not, this is the strings of this puppet are not being pulled from above. These groups are forming locally in response to local conditions. And, in Alberta, at the edge of the prairie, you have your own local conditions. Which big city are you close to or part of? Edmonton. Okay. There's a non-profit sector in Edmonton. There are groups working on these issues. I don't see any lack of activism in Edmonton or in Calgary. I'm more familiar with I think with Calgary. But food forests, yeah, I mean, Seattle, we've looked at food orchards here in Boston. Another big issue, I think, that is creeping up the agenda is foraging. All ethnic groups forage. They forage for different things: Chinese Americans, African Americans, Italian Americans, the Jewish people. And so in foraging, we have I think, a place that we could look at food look towards lessening food insecurity. But here's the problem. Most cities don't want you to forage because of the liability issues of you picking something in a local park or a local woodland and then eating it and getting sick. But within foraging, I think there is a potential, and I know it's not quite food forests, but within foraging, there is a huge potential, I think, for both intercultural understanding and for building a larger movement for local food, for food justice, etc. So I'll leave it there. Food forests, I mean, they're part of the solution, but I don't think in themselves they are, entirely the solution. Just one final thing. I mean, this first question was about production, and I absolutely agree with Anik that we don't have a world food production problem. We have a world food distribution problem, and that's the crisis that we have at the moment, and that needs to change.
What is the connection between agricultural deskilling, loss of farmer agency, and the appropriation of food movements by corporate or mainstream interests? In India, for instance, the Green Revolution practices have led to many cultural shifts in terms of diet changes, among others, creating food amnesia in some sense.
Well, you're taking me back to my 1970s geography degree when we learned about the Green Revolution and what a disaster it has been. When heritage seeds that have been used by local people for thousands of years started to be replaced by these super seeds from the big agricultural companies. Look, we haven't mentioned it. We have commodified food. Food is a commodity such that now, and the Green Revolution was the major commodification of food. It brought food into industrial agriculture, and it brought food, or it took food away from local people's control. So we do need to look at, in terms of a just food system, ways of decommodifying and getting back to the system that you had before the Green Revolution, which wasn't perfect, but at least your local seeds were adapted to local conditions, etc., and didn't require massive amounts of fertilizers and pesticides, etc. Just one point I want to make on urban agriculture. I sat on a PhD panel at the University of Ghent in Belgium, and a young woman was doing her thesis PhD defense on some excellent work she'd done looking at urban agriculture in Philadelphia, in Ghent, and in Warsaw in Poland. And one of the committee kept saying, but urban food is never going to feed the world. And in the end, I got really annoyed and I said, that's not the point she's making. The point she's making is that urban agriculture is about building community as much as it is about building, stable local food systems and feeding people. It is through food justice, which in the US is very much tied to local economic justice. You saw the local food system I described from Boston. We combine food justice with local economic determination, especially for disadvantaged groups. So I think these 2 points, we need to decommodify to the extent that we can, and we also need to understand urban agriculture as having multiple goals, but probably the most significant goal that it's going to have is building local agency, building local confidence, building local power to effect change.
What can food researchers and activists do to improve and encourage more solidarity and strategic collaboration between the typical localism food movement and the food justice movement?
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think, because I mean, from what I got from Julian's talk is that, yeah, they are somewhat at odds. So I would say, coming from kind of my work and how I look at things, I would say it is kind of creating a space in which you can highlight how the futures that they envision don't have space for the other. And I think that a lot of people haven't really kind of considered it in its full effect. Like when we are talking about eat fresh, eat local, like what am I considering? What am I including, and who am I excluding? I think it's making that process very explicit that will hopefully help to at least bring some people together. There will always be people who will be unwilling, but I think it's focusing on the people who are willing and that do see, like, I am excluding people with this particular vision and with this particular kind of future imaginary that I put out there.
What does decommodified food look like, and how can it be brought about?
Well, you know, the closest I think that we have at the moment is Belo Horizonte, in the sense that while food is still a commodity, they invoke the Brazilian right to food. So any form of decommodified food futures has to start with the notion that food is a right rather than a product that is, you know, variously priced based on what the retailer thinks he, she, they can get in terms of a price. So I think first thing is notion of a right to food. The second thing is centering this idea of food with dignity. You know, I was thinking about it. If we had in the US popular restaurants, people's restaurants that were run by the government, they would be slop houses. We would remind people that they were getting welfare. We would remind people constantly that this was, you know, this was charity. It wouldn't be like those Brazilian ones where food with dignity. People can go in and eat a good meal at a very fair price in a dignified environment. It wouldn't be like that in the United States. So decommodifying food would, I think, require the centering of food justice, the centering of the notion of a right to food, and the idea of food with dignity. Why is it in the US that the most food insecure people are food workers? Why is it that those Californian growers or the people that take the food out of the ground from Mexico, El Salvador, Central America, that they can't afford to buy the food that they are cultivating? So we have a system at the moment where, certainly in the United States, where, you know, this notion of food is just part of another commodity. Just like if you want to live in a nice, green, sustainable neighborhood, you're going to pay a premium. Shouldn't everybody have sustainable neighborhoods? So I think decommodification is a goal we should look towards, but I do think cities can have a role in it. And I'm thinking about a very wealthy city like Boston, with a progressive mayor, with a food justice agenda, who's changed the name of the Office of Food Access to the Office of Food Justice. Talk about narrative changes and changing the discourse. That's a really significant change. We should be able to do something here in a wealthy city like Boston. And if it cost less than 2% of the city's budget and had those huge effects that Belo Horizonte has had over the last 30 years in terms of improving kids' attention in schools, there have been measurable improvements. And in fact, Francis Moore Lappe, the food writer in the United States, called Belo Horizonte the city that abolished hunger. So let's look to cities like Belo Horizonte. I don't think we can do it on a federal scale. It's not going to happen. But I think local, state and city-based agencies could really look towards stages of decommodification that I think would be very positive.
Then I will ask Julia if she wants to show us how she has harvested this conversation, and then I will move to close the event.
Yes, I will show you. I will share my screen. I hope you can all see it. I have to do a few clicks. I think you can see my screen right now. Yes, there it is. So I've been listening to the meeting and drawing on my iPad. So this is a very quick version of my my visual notes, my wrap up. So I'm gonna finish this 24 hours later. But as you can see, I thought of like a table with a tablecloth, like a restaurant. So here are a few portraits of Annick, for example, and the one of Julian. And I added all the quotes they have been talking about, and I'm going to draw around the quotes. So these are quick sketches. For example, a grandma with an avocado. Maybe she doesn't know what it is. Or a food forest. or it was about shaping the future. I thought about a hamburger. How do you create and build a hamburger? So that's my metaphor for using it. Also, what is local? Is it geographic local or translocal? It's very important, I think. Yeah, so there are a lot of different things. This is an African, like a special tagine, I don't know how you call it. So it was to create home. So I'm gonna add more like dishes from all around the world. So yeah, this is my visual note, but you will see the finished product. I think everyone gets to see it. So thank you for joining.
Thank you very much. All right. We're a little over time, but I hope everyone can still stay for last minute. So thank you for the beautiful drawing, Julia. That was, look forward to seeing the finished product as always. There are always beautiful renditions that really help illustrate the thoughts of the event. To close today's event, my colleagues are going to share a feedback form in the chat, so please fill that in so that we can improve on future events. It will only take a minute. One of the feedback I can imagine maybe could come is that we didn't have time for the last question, which was a really interesting one. And maybe an idea is we will share the last question with the follow-up so that we have some food for thought, and then obviously everyone can see how they want to answer it themselves. This is obviously not an event where we could answer all of the questions, and we cannot solve the problems of food justice in an hour and a half, but hopefully we could get some way there at least. Then in the coming weeks, we will follow up today's event with an email containing this visual harvest and announcing the blog post of the event that will also include the recording of the event and the harvesting document as well, and all the links and the resources that were shared during the event. If you want to stay in touch with us, please consider following our socials. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and join the mailing list on Just Sustainability Transitions. And in the meantime, feel free to explore our past events and the publication series I mentioned at the beginning of the event. Then looking forward, next week, Thursday, as I mentioned before, as part of the Drift Food Month, there will also be an event on the directionalities of agri-food systems research, which has already been touched upon today, but will then be expanded on next week. So that is Thursday next week, and same time as today. Thank you very much. And before I leave, I'll quickly mention that we're leaving the discussion open for a few minutes for everyone to have the chance to share some last-minute thoughts and resources. And again, all the links and resources will be shared with you in the coming weeks. And with that said, I want to especially thank Julian Aguiman for having had the time to come here, and Anik for also your very inspirational talk, and everyone that was able to attend today for this very fruitful conversation. Thank you.